Okay, so our next presentation is going to be comparing food to drugs and dietary supplements. They all have different paths to regulation. And we have someone on our ODS team who came off the injured reserve list to be here with you today. So we're really grateful to Dr. Betz for coming in and doing this for us. How many of you have heard of a pharmacognosist? Okay, well, if I said that in a normal crowd, most people would say no, but you guys are a different audience. So I consider him to be one of the best pharmacognosist in the world, and we are so lucky to have him. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph Betz.
Thank you, Reagan. I've recently had my knees replaced, so if I sit down halfway through, you'll understand why. A long time ago, I worked at FDA, so I have a little bit of experience with some of this stuff, and I actually lived through some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. And some of the slides and some of the information is fairly old, back from the 90s. But I think it's the best illustration there is from a time when FDA and industry and consumers were all trying to figure out what the rules were following the passage of Dechet. So because I talk too much, I'll get right into the talk itself. First thing is, according to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, products are foods, dietary supplements, or drugs based on their intended use. Okay, doesn't really matter what it's made out of. If you make a disease-curing claim for distilled water, FDA can, if they so choose, regulate that as a drug. And whatever regulations for that category, food, drug, or dietary supplement, are the regulations that apply to that commercial product. Intended use is ascertained by labeling claims, advertising materials, oral or written statements that the manufacturer makes about the product. So the manufacturer is in control of what the product is, because they're the ones that create the labels and the advertisements and things like that. Just as a note that I added, because I give this similar talks in other countries, there is no regulatory category for functional foods in the United States. There are in several other countries. FDA considers the regulations about health claims for conventional foods sufficient to cover the intent of functional foods. FDA regulates products. This is very important. Commercial products in interstate commerce. They don't regulate the practice of medicine at all. Individual states regulate the practice of medicine. So if you've got a bottle of pills with a label on it, that's what FDA regulates, and they regulate it in interstate commerce. If you were able to create a product entirely within a single state, get all your materials, or all your packaging materials, your bottles, the cotton that goes in, all within a single state, and none of that stuff cross state lines, FDA has no authority over that product. So, to get right to the heart of things. Drugs are intended, and these are more or less quotes directly from the Code of Federal Regulations. Drugs are articles intended to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, prevent disease in man or animals, affect the structure or function of the body. This part of the law is older than Dechet, and it caused some consternation when the Dechet came out and people started talking about structure-function claims, and we'll talk about that just a little bit later. And anything listed in an official compendium can be considered a drug, something like the United States Pharmacopoeia. The key to drugs and the regulation of drugs is that drugs must be generally recognized as safe and effective. GRASE, G-R-A-S-E. We'll talk about that difference between that and foods in a little bit. Because of the safe and effective part, pre-market approval is required for drugs, for new drugs, via the investigational new drug process and the new drug application process. So there's pre-market approval. FDA looks at the data and says, yes, you can market this product based on their evaluation of whether it's safe or effective. This is a very lot of bullets for one slide, but I wanted to cover as much of the regulatory environment for drugs as possible. Drugs are unsafe by definition until the sponsor, who is the manufacturer, proves otherwise to FDA. So that's that whole pre-market approval side of things. Unsafe by definition. Pre-market review and approval is by FDA. They review for efficacy as well as safety. There are user fees associated with this process. So when a company wants to try and get a new drug approved, they pay FDA to look at the approval. There are mandatory formulation standards that are reviewed in advance of the marketing. So part of the investigational new drug application process involves the company giving chemistry, manufacturing, and control information to the FDA, and FDA reviews that information, the formulation standards, how it's made, before the company can proceed with the process. There is obviously product registration because everything has to go through FDA. FDA approves the claims. That's the whole efficacy and safety part. Manufacturer is prohibited from selling a new drug without pre-market approval. If they do sell a drug that has not yet been approved, then they're guilty of selling an adulterated drug. The manufacturer has to comply with drug-specific current good manufacturing practice, CGMP, as well as drug labeling regulations. The manufacturer for prescription drugs is responsible for reporting serious adverse events to FDA. And the manufacturer bears all of these regulatory burdens. They bear the cost of all of this stuff, of doing the clinical trials, of developing the new chemical entity, doing the preclinical animal work. The manufacturer pays for all of that stuff. That's why the drug approval process is expensive. So, because this is a relatively short talk, we have to jump fairly quickly. Foods, articles used for food, drug, or drink for man or other animals, chewing gum, and articles used for components of any such article. That's pretty much a quote, a direct quote of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of the definitions of food. It's essentially article used for food are food. That's essentially the gist of the definition. They add some more language about consumed for taste, aroma, and nutritive value further on in the regulation, but essentially it's foods are foods. There is such a thing as medical foods. They were authorized by Congress, but FDA has never gotten around to writing the regulations. So in any of these regulatory things, you have the statute, which lays out the broad strokes. It's essentially the skeleton of the laws. But then FDA or another regulatory agency writes the regulations that flesh out these statutes. Well, there's a skeleton for medical foods, so there is a medical foods category created by Congress, but FDA has never gotten to the point of issuing regulations to flesh out that skeleton for medical foods. So medical foods are confusing, and I'm not going to talk about them because they're confusing. And it's a short lecture. New ingredients in food. A new ingredient added to a food is considered to be a food additive unless it's generally recognized as safe. GRAS. You may recognize that acronym. Notice that as opposed to drugs, it doesn't have an E at the end of it. So we're talking GRAS instead of GRAS-E. They have to be generally recognized as safe by qualified experts. Generally recognized as safe for their intended use. So just because something is GRAS as a food additive for addition to a food doesn't mean you're allowed to just dump grams of the stuff into that food. You have to add the minimum amount to achieve the technical effect. So if you're using an artificial color or an artificial flavor, you can't just dump a vat load into your food. You have to use the minimum amount necessary to achieve the color or the odor that you're trying to achieve. This is a safety thing. The evaluation by qualified experts has to be performed by scientific procedures, whether it's an animal toxicology study or something like that. This is fairly important. A substance used in food prior to January 1st, 1958 is considered to have a history of use and is grandfathered. and we'll talk about grandfathering later when we talk about the shea. So for foods and food additives, it's 1958 is the key date. So anything that was on the market legally prior to 1958 can continue to be sold. FDA does go and do periodic reappraisals of the safety of some ingredients, and there's one notable example, a substance called norhdihydrogoric acid, NDGA. It's a substance that's found naturally in a plant, chaparral, that was at one time an approved food additive for its antioxidant properties. And FDA reevaluated it and removed it from the market because it caused some animals' kidneys to fall out. So FDA does go back and look at old ingredients every once in a while. The food label, I'm not focusing at all on good manufacturing practice or other parts of the regulations, because the consumer and the nutritionist who's doing this sort of work is exposed to this stuff kind of in a forensic way. You'll see a food label or a package label, and you have to decide what it is, whether it's legal. So the manufacturer has the advantage of knowing what's supposed to be there, but you as a consumer or as even a regulator, especially for food, are in a position of looking at a label, determining whether the label is legal and whether it provides enough information to you to make recommendations about its use for nutrition or for anything else. So food labels have to have a statement of identity or the name of the food and the net quantity statement or the amount of the product on the principal display panel. So the principal display panel is, if you've got a box, it's usually, is this a laser pointer? All right, so if this is a cereal box, for instance, so the big wide front of the box is the principal display panel, then other information goes on the side of the box, which is the information panel. If it's a bottle or a jar or something like that, then this is the arrangement for principal display panel and information panel. And this is just a description of what I just showed you in the picture. Information panel has to have the name, place of business of the manufacturer or the packer or the distributor, the ingredient list, any nutrition labeling, required allergy labeling, label identification of artificial flavoring, coloring, chemicals, or preservatives. So that goes on that side label. It's not on the principal display panel. There are federal regulations that tell you what font size and all that business, where this information has to go. If you're really into this stuff, I provide this information. You can just enter this. Years ago when I started at FDA, you couldn't do this, but you can just enter 21 CFR Part 101 in Google and get right to several websites that give you the exact text. There are academic websites, there's the Food and Drug Administration's website, and you don't have to have this enormous URL that takes you directly to FDA. You can do the search based just on that. So that's why I tend to include this stuff. The nutrition facts label was fairly static for a relatively long amount of time. The requirement for a nutrition facts label goes back to NLEA, Nutrition Labeling and Education Act of 1990. In May of 2016, just a couple of days over a year ago, there were new regulations published about what's required on the nutrition facts label for nutrition labeling. The main changes are the list of nutrients that are required or permitted to be declared is updated. Vitamin D and potassium are required on the label now. They weren't before. Calcium and iron continue to be required as they were before. Vitamins A and C are no longer required, but can be included on a voluntary basis. This is for conventional foods. This is because of some research that was done by FDA, and I believe the Academy of Medicine on nutrients status, and it was found that nutrition status for vitamins A and C in the U.S. was pretty much replete, so it's not as important a nutrient as it was thought previously. There's some other things, some technical things on the nutrition facts label. So the serving size font has to be in a bigger, bolder type than the old label. Serving sizes are updated because it was estimated that companies were basically lying when they told you what size the serving size was, which gave you either an overestimation or an underestimation of the number of calories and things like that, of nutrients. The number of calories is in a larger font, a larger type. Added sugars have to be included on a nutrition facts label. So if there's any, so there's the total, there was the total sugars on the label before, but now if there's any added sugars, those have to be labeled and listed as well. Let's see. Actual amounts of these particular nutrients have to be declared, and as I mentioned earlier, there's a change in the nutrients required. There's also a new footnote. See if I can read it. Oh, that deals with the percent daily value. It's kind of an explanation of what the percent daily value is in relation to the total number of calories consumed and things like that. So those are the main structural changes in the nutrition facts label. And as I said, those new regulations are about a year old. What kinds of claims besides nutrient content claims can you make? Well, you can make health claims. That goes back to NLEA in 1990. You can make the nutrient content claims. Those are the claims that were on the nutrient facts label. Nutrient content claims can also be the sort of claims that say a good source of, and then insert nutrient here. There are things called qualified health claims, and there are structure function claims. A little bit more detail on health claims. A health claim describes a relationship between a substance and a disease or a health-related condition. So you can actually use the word disease on a food label with an approved health claim, something that you cannot do with a dietary supplement for the most part. Health claims require prior authorization by FDA, so there's sort of a pre-market approval process for these health claims. You submit your data and your evidence to FDA. FDA says yes, you can make a claim on your Cheerios about fiber and cancer or heart disease or whatever the claim is. Unqualified, these actual health claims, when people use the word health claim, they really are unqualified health claims because FDA has done some pre-market review and found that the claims are backed by strong evidence. The standard of evidence is significant scientific agreement. There are also, and this was the result of a lawsuit, a First Amendment lawsuit, there are things called qualified health claims. You can make a qualified health claim. It still has to be looked at by FDA, but you have to provide the totality of the evidence for the claim. So if there are any caveats and disclaimers, so if 4 studies said, oat bran is good for such and such, and 7 studies said there's no effect, that's not significant scientific agreement. You can make the statement, but you have to have those, those caveats. You have to make the statement that, a few studies have shown that this is true, and a bunch of other studies have shown that it's not true. So that tends to make for a very large label. So it takes a lot of space on the label by the time you end up adding all these caveats and disclaimers. But they are permitted, and those are called qualified health claims. You can make health claims, both qualified and unqualified, for both conventional foods or dietary supplements. But the thing about health claims is they relate nutrients in the food or the dietary supplement to the disease or health-related conditions. So a lot of the dietary supplements, especially botanical dietary supplements or things like glucosamine and chondroitin, don't have much in the way of an actual nutrient content in them. So there's very little, vitamins, minerals, macronutrients in something like St. John's wort, which is why, for the most part, you won't see health claims on botanical dietary supplements and a lot of other types of dietary supplements as well. You can see health claims on other types of dietary supplements. So it's something like a fish oil capsule. The fish oil is oil, it's fatty acids, those are nutrients. You could probably make a health claim about the health beneficial effects of a dietary supplement with fish oil. Somewhere on the label you have to identify the nutrient level to which the claim refers. So you can't fairy dust products with a nutrient and say this is good for heart disease or cancer. This is the list of FDA-approved health claims. You have it in your handout. I'm not going to read all these things, but you'll recognize some of them: calcium osteoporosis, sodium hypertension, plant stanol and sterols and cardiovascular disease, soy protein, soluble fiber and cardiovascular disease. That's your essentially your Cheerios health claim. Switch gears. Dietary supplement is any product other than tobacco that contains a vitamin, mineral, herb, or other botanical. You had this from Dr. Swift this morning a little bit. I just wanted to present this because it allows me to add this, not represented as a conventional food. And this will become important in one of my case study examples at the tail end of the talk. So everybody knows the definition of a dietary supplement now. Everybody knows what can be in a dietary supplement, what can't be in a dietary supplement. But this is very important. So you can't have Jetson's pills. You can't have a pill that you would say, well, here's your bacon and eggs for breakfast, and call it a dietary supplement, because that would be representing it as a conventional food. So the label, back to labels. Again, we're not talking about good manufacturing practice or anything else. So again, same as with the food label: statement of identity, the net quantity, any nutrition labeling, except instead of calling it nutrient facts or nutrition facts, we call it supplement facts. The ingredient list, the name and place of business. These are all required elements on the label. There's the principal display panel, statement of identity, net quantity of contents, any claims and all that kind of stuff are on the information panel. So your structure function claim goes here, directions for use go here, supplement facts. In this case, there's no nutrient content claimed, so it just tells you how much of a botanical extract is present. In this case, it's oriental ginseng powdered 250 micrograms. Any other ingredients, coloring agents, gelatin for the capsule covers, water, glycerin, all that kind of stuff goes in the other ingredients part. Name and place of business of the manufacturer. So it's very similar to the food label with a couple of other, minor things thrown in. The label somewhere has to have the word dietary supplement on it so that you know that you're buying a dietary supplement. Ingredient identity on the information panel can get kind of complicated for botanicals. So you can use a common or usual name for a botanical. If you use a common name, that common name has to be in the American Herbal Products Association's book, Herbs of Commerce. If you don't have an Herbs of Commerce common name, then you have to use the Latin name of the plant, which is a Latin binomial, along with the author, the person who created the name. And you also have to indicate what the plant part used was. So a common name that's accepted is St. John's wort. So you would have to put something like St. John's wort above ground parts, which is leaves, stems, and flowers, if for a botanical ingredient. You have to indicate the quantity of each ingredient. There is one thing that makes reading these labels complicated. There's such a thing as the proprietary blend concept. So if you've ever read a can of Campbell's soup, they don't tell you exactly how much tomato is in the tomato soup. There'll be a list of ingredients. There'll be tomatoes, spices, water, etc. That's because they don't want to give the competitors the key to reverse engineering their product. So it's called a proprietary blend concept. The ingredients have to be listed in descending order of the percentage that they occur in the product. So for tomato soup, probably the first ingredient might be water, and the second ingredient might be tomato. And then spices, and the smaller the amount that's in the product, the lower down it goes on that list. Well, that concept is true of botanicals as well. So the example that I showed you said 250 micrograms of powdered oriental ginseng. But if that was a proprietary blend, you just have a list of botanicals with no quantities next to the botanicals. They have to give the total amount of the blend, but they don't have to give the percentage or the amount of the individual ingredients. You have to try and figure out which is the prominent ingredient by where it is on that list. And then 21 CFR Part 111 or 101 compliant, which is the labeling rules. There is a supplement facts rather than a nutrient facts panel. As with foods, you are allowed to make authorized health claims. They can be either qualified or unqualified. Very few people are bothered with this with dietary supplements because they're allowed to make structure function claims. And structure function claims don't have to be pre-approved by the FDA. The structure function claims do have to be substantiated, so the company is responsible for showing that those claims are true and not misleading. Although FDA does not get to review the evidence for that substantiation. They're not allowed to ask for the evidence. So so FDA does pre-market approval for the health claims, so you have to show them the evidence, but for structure function claims, these statements of nutritional support, FDA does not get to review those. That's in the next bullet point here. However, if somebody like the Federal Trade Commission, which does have authority over this sort of thing, goes in and decides that there aren't any clinical trials to support this, then unsubstantiated claims are considered to be misbranding. Just a little technical. Instead of adulteration, they're misbranded the product. There are mandatory disclaimers that have to go on a label if you make a structure function claim. One of the mandatory disclaimers is this product is not intended to diagnose, cure, or prevent any disease. That's so that you can't confuse this product with a drug product. And that's mandatory on a label. If a label makes a claim, it has to have this disclaimer on it. There was kind of an obscure rule that was important at the time it was passed. You used to be able to go to a health food store, and that's where you got most dietary supplements back in the 80s and 90s, was health food stores, not CVS or Target or something like that. And you'd see racks and racks and racks of publications. And at one time, FDA considered those publications about how wonderful St. John's wort was as part of labeling for the St. John's wort products. So Congress, when they wrote the act, decided that those publications are a First Amendment exercise in free speech, and as long as they don't make a direct correlation to any of the brands, as long as you don't mention the brands that store is selling, then those are not considered to be labeling. This is fairly important for regulatory purposes. It's kind of obscure, but I'm that kind of guy. The first encounter with structure function claims in the DSHEA, they're actually called statements of nutritional support, not structure function claims. And then later on they refer to them as structure function claims. Remember the earlier definition of drugs that said something that affects the structure or the function of the body is a drug? Well, this kind of confused a lot of people. So Congress, when they created the original language, talked about statements of nutritional support and then created a shorthand that just called them structure function claims. It's still kind of confusing. A structure function claims describes the role of an ingredient or its mechanism intended to affect the structure or function in humans. So you can make a claim about maintaining healthy joints from something like glucosamine. So the ingredient is glucosamine, and it supports healthy joints. You can't say anything about osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis because then it becomes a drug, but you can say supports a healthy joint function. Can't claim to diagnose, et cetera, diseases. The manufacturer, as I said, has required to have substantiation that the statement is truthful and not misleading. FDA is not allowed to ask for it. So therefore, these claims don't require prior FDA approval. and companies are required to add a second disclaimer to a label. These claims have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. So if you make a claim, you have to add a second disclaimer in addition to the first one that I already mentioned. So this is kind of a comparison between structure-function claims and disease claims. So a structure-function claim on a dietary supplement might be helps maintain normal cholesterol levels. A disease claim would be lowers cholesterol. Why do you want to lower cholesterol? Well, to prevent cardiovascular disease, that's an implied disease claim. Again, I won't read all of these. Supports the immune system, supports the body's antiviral capabilities. This confuses a lot of people because there's a lot of clinical trials out there that actually use the D word. So echinacea for the prevention of an experimental rhinovirus colds, those people used a dietary supplement product that they bought somewhere, like at a supermarket, and did a drug study. This clinical trial is a drug study because it's a prevention of colds. You're not allowed to prevent, cure, mitigate a disease without being a drug. So this is actually a drug study that was performed using a dietary supplement product. Same with St. John's wort. St. John's wort in major depressive disorder. All right, that's not a helps maintain a healthy mood claim, but it was a clinical trial. Now, some of these clinical trials had investigational new drug applications filed. Some of them didn't. Saw palmetto on lower urinary tract symptoms. Now, this I throw in just to fool people, because benign prostate hypertrophy, which is what we're talking about here, is not considered a disease by FDA. It's a normal condition of aging if you're a guy. The only reason this study had a IND is because this was a dose escalation study, and the third level of the product was 3 times the concentration of any product on the market as a dietary supplement. So for safety purposes, they filed an IND with FDA. I was a co-author in this study, so I know a lot about it. So, as I said, drug studies done with supplement products may require an investigational new drug application. You don't always see that. And it's ODS policy, and I believe NCCIH policy, that if you propose to do a clinical trial, an intervention trial with a dietary supplement product, you have to send a letter to FDA saying, do we need an IND? And FDA makes the call. NIH doesn't make the call on that. There was, and I think Dr. Swift covered this a little bit, there was a law passed in 2006, and essentially what it required was extra information on the label because it's now mandatory for companies to maintain records about serious adverse events that occur from dietary supplements as well as OTC drugs. Before 2006, you had to report serious adverse events for prescription drugs, but not for OTC drugs or for dietary supplements. So this is just a quickie, just extra thing for dietary supplements. So the conclusion, product classification, the rules change depending on which box the manufacturer decides to put their product into, food, drug, dietary supplements. There's a continuum of effects or outcomes from basic nutrition through health promotion to cure, treat, mitigate. Some of these areas here, there can be a little slippery and a little bit confusing. The rules change depending on the box. The manufacturer decides on which box based on their intended use, their labeling, etc. If the company messes up, FDA is left to try and figure out which box was intended by the company, and then we'll use the appropriate regulatory framework to enforce it. FDA tends not to be generous in this effect. So if there's kind of confusion about whether it's a food or a dietary supplement, FDA will use the dietary supplement rules. We'll use the drug rules if there's confusion. So they'll go to the higher standard, which is expensive for companies. This is probably my favorite case study. There's a company called Hain Celestial Seasonings. Hain, back in 1999, 5 years after passage of the thought it would be a great idea to market a line of dietary supplements in cans. So they created the Hain's Kitchen Prescription line. It was chicken broth and noodles with echinacea, tomato basil with St. John's wort. The company submitted notice of claims with labels to FDA asserting that the products were dietary supplements. The labels had pictures of soup, use of the word soup, use of the phrase heat and serve, references to tomatoes, split pea, chicken broth. Those are all food ingredients or foods, and included echinacea and St. John's wort as part of the ingredients list. And they made structure function claims about the products. As I said, the companies are called herbal supplements by the company. However, FDA took a look at these products. Didn't take very long for FDA to take a look at those products, and concluded that those label statements, like calling themselves soups and calling themselves delicious and all this kind of stuff, meant that the intended use for these products was to be conventional food. Therefore, they can't be dietary supplements. Under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, ingredients intentionally added to conventional food have to be used in accordance with food additive regulations, unless they're grass. And the agency wrote in their warning letters to this company that they were not aware of the basis for concluding that St. John's wort and echinacea are grass for general use in conventional foods. So FDA said these can't be conventional foods because they're adulterated with unapproved food additives, echinacea and St. John's wort. The company itself and its packaging and labeling said these are, implicated or implied that these are foods. Because they were not dietary supplements, structure function claims are permitted for foods, by the way, I forgot to mention that. But those structure function claims for conventional foods have to be based on nutrient content. So the structure function claims for these products were based on the content of St. John's wort and echinacea, not nutrients. Therefore, those are inappropriate structure function claims. Also, FDA said the name of the product line, Kitchen Prescription, suggests that the product may be intended to diagnose, cure, mitigate, or treat a disease. Therefore, it could also be considered to be an unapproved new drug. So what we had here was something claiming to be a dietary supplement that was an adulterated food because it contained unapproved food additives, and also an adulterated drug because it had the word prescription in the name, implying that it was a drug or used to cure or treat. So this line of soups disappeared from the marketplace shortly after FDA issued their warning letters. There are other companies that took FDA's warnings to heart and changed their labeling, changed their advertisements, in some cases changed the category, and ended up with a product that's still on the market today. Benecol is the one product. They started out as a dietary supplement. FDA slapped them around a bit, and then Benecol had plenty of clinical trials, so they submitted the clinical trial data from Sweden and elsewhere to FDA, and they changed themselves into a food additive. So Benecol is now still on the market as a salad dressing and as a margarine substitute because the company decided it was worth it to go ahead and do that. So these were all the things that FDA told the company that they had to do, and the company just decided it was too expensive to do it. The substantiation of structure function effects and all that kind of stuff. This is a segue into the next part, which is what you see today. It goes back to 2000. So this is a warning letter about a product called Arizona RX Stress Relief Elixir. The beverages that are the Arizona iced tea company. So the company existed, and they created a line back in the 2000s called Arizona RX Stress Relief Elixir. Had a lot of the same problems as the previous case. Enhanced with Panax ginseng, kava, chamomile, valerian, fortified with minerals. So kava, valerian were unapproved food additives. You can use ginseng, believe it or not, as an approved food additive because it was being eaten by people in the 1890s, 1910s. So again, the same problems as the kitchen prescription with unapproved food additives, kava and valerian. So this line took the RX out of it. Some of the companies started calling themselves dietary supplements instead of beverages. So this was an article from the Washington Post in 2001, food claim crackdown. If this was a better picture, you'd see that Odwalla, there's some fairly, that's a Celestial Seasonings beverage. There's some fairly big companies involved in that. And it was basically for the same thing that I just told you about. All of this confusion about beverages especially, the food side kind of settled out fairly quickly in the late 90s, early 2000s, but the beverages was kind of confusing. So you saw things that were sold in giant cans and calling themselves dietary supplements, these energy drinks calling themselves dietary supplements. So FDA was told by Congress to write some guidance for industry on how to distinguish liquid dietary supplements from beverages. So company Rockstar, you may have heard of, changed their labeling. So now they're energy punches, energy drink, but they changed their labeling and their ingredients so that they became conventional beverages rather than dietary supplements. And you can tell because that's got a nutrition facts label on it. And if you could read any of that stuff, you'd see that the list of things that are in there are not unapproved food additives. They're not weird botanicals like some of the other stuff. What it boiled down to was FDA said that if a beverage provides enough hydration to be a hydrating material, then it's a food. So a 12-ounce can of something, a 16-ounce can of something is probably a food because there's enough water there to actually do hydration. Something in smaller sizes, so this bottle is 1.93 fluid ounces, does not contain enough water to actually do any good as far as a hydrating agent. So this one still has a supplement facts label. So essentially, there's other things in the guidance that FDA provided about permitted ingredients and not permitted ingredients and stuff like that. But the biggest thing came down to the volume of water that was in a product as to whether it was a supplement or whether it was a diet or it was a conventional food. And that's it. So I think that I ran a couple minutes over, but not as much as I usually do.